So the first thing is just a very brief project overview, just by show of hands. How many of you all here did not attend either of the workshops that we had in January and February? Okay, so some of you are new. That's great. It is sort of a mix. So this is sort of a compilation of several slides that we showed back then that focus on the sort of what is this project, what do we hope to achieve, what are our core principles, and what is the sort of overview of the process. And as you can see, there's a map up here. It's a 1.4 mile long corridor. I think we all know where we are. And it shows a sort of dash box that sort of highlights the sort of focal area of the project. But as I said at the last workshops, we're not limiting ourselves to any hard lines. We want to look at this in a very comprehensive manner. And if there are opportunities or there are reasons to look past those lines, or maybe even sort of, kind of dial in a little bit, we just want to do that. So we will ultimately right-size this, but this is our sort of, I guess you could call it, starting point for the project. And then we talked about these several core principles, and it really, the first two are really about recognizing the history and the injustices that have happened over the course of 50 plus years here, and really being able to take that and to translate it into opportunity and healing and a process that is really community-led. We want to pledge that we are always going to be open and engage in a two-way dialogue. And then finally, this timeline on the bottom really just highlights that we are still very much in early days. I would actually put this star in the middle of that gray box because we did have our actual workshops back in January and February, and so we're in the midst of really starting to formulate visions, goals, preferences that will lead us into the concepts that will come out of that and be the sort of blueprint for where we're going to be going throughout this process. And as you can see, it says it's a 2-year process. Even though we've gotten sort of a soft, gradual, start over the last 6 months, things will start ramping up in a major way after summer. We know that summertime is a place where a lot of people are out of town. It's hard to get people to come to meetings, but because we want to maximize the actual participation to the extent possible, we will be having more frequent meetings and hopefully larger meetings going into the fall, winter, and into next year. We expect that the project will wrap up with a preferred alternative and a great vision by the end of 2025, maybe even sooner, but certainly by the end of next year. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Tabia, who's going to walk us through a lot of great information.
Thank you, Stu. And as Stu mentioned, my name is Tabia Gamble. I have been the project manager on the consultant team for this first phase of the project. And so some of the items that I want to walk us through today are sort of what we've heard up to now. So as Stu mentioned, we held 2 workshops in January and February of this year, which they were the same workshop presenting the same information, just making it more accessible. But even prior to that, there's been a lot of items that we've learned from. So as you can see here, there's been previous plans that have been developed for this corridor. And so this team is not sort of starting from scratch or starting over, but really building upon what we've already learned. And so looking through those plans, some of the key themes that we've learned that the community is interested in is neighborhood revitalization, community restoration, thinking about transit reliability and connectivity, both within this corridor, but also to other parts of the region, right? Thinking to downtown and other areas within Maryland. Oh, there we go. Thinking about green space and livable space, maximizing some of the green space, expanding upon that, and adding to that. Thinking about housing affordability, economic development, commercial and retail growth. So we understand that prior to the construction of the Highway to Nowhere, this was a bustling area, and so finding ways that we could bring that back to the community. Thinking about bicycle and pedestrian safety, there are several high crash intersections throughout this corridor, particularly right around Franklin and Mulberry, on where folks are entering and exiting into the expressway, and so finding ways that we can improve the pedestrian and cyclist safety. And then understanding that this is also a food desert. So are there things that we can bring into maybe this project or other projects that are happening to address that? Understanding also that the Giant on Edmondson Avenue is closing, I believe either today or tomorrow, and this week it will be closing. And so sort of that is expanding the food desert. And so looking at ways that we can address that. And then historic preservation and just overall quality of life for residents. So these are a lot of the items that through the plans that we've researched, the community is interested in. The Department of Transportation, Department of Planning, and other agencies have already identified as some key issues. And then outside of just looking at the plans that have been developed both by communities and agencies, we have done some different listening sessions and pop-ups. And so what you'll see is sort of a repeat of a lot of the key themes that we're seeing in those documents. So when we're talking to people and through the listening session, we heard that folks are really interested, again, in neighborhood access, safety and accessibility, improving transit reliability and the connectivity, connecting with residents that previously lived in this area who were sort of taken out of their homes by the construction, engaging the community in a meaningful manner, and sort of building community consensus. So not coming in again and telling the community what they need, but really trying to build up with the community's vision. And then thinking about the environment, again, sustainability and environmental enhancements, and like we said earlier, that neighborhood revitalization, really bringing this community back from the disinvestment that it's seen. And then when you're thinking about the economy, economic development, commercial development, and retail growth opportunities are what folks have expressed interest in, as well as financial reimbursement or some type of compensation to the long-term residents or residents that were forced to move out of this area, but have an interest in returning or their children returning, and really thinking about some of that generational wealth. And so that is sort of what we were coming into these community workshops thinking about and building upon. And some of the exercises that we did in those workshops in January and February focused on hearing from the community, what are the areas that we want to preserve throughout this corridor? What are some of the opportunity areas, as well as some of the existing challenges that folks are interested in being addressed? And so through those exercises, some of the opportunities that we heard about are multimodal improvements, thinking about areas like the West Baltimore MARC station, how are we getting pedestrian and bicyclist connectivity there? Transit-oriented development, again, really focused around the West Baltimore MARC station. Addressing transportation safety, as I mentioned, there are several high crash intersections right in this corridor, and so trying to address those areas. Looking at more efficient and reliable transit, there are several projects that MTA is working on that are right in this area, so how can we maximize and catalyze off of those projects? Creating new and improved community green spaces, creating new and diverse development, not just affordable housing, but thinking about mixed-use housing and other types of uses in the corridor as well. Thinking about shared spaces, community rec centers, and different items like that are some of the different opportunities that folks expressed interest in. And of course, with opportunities, there come challenges. Again, this was an infrastructure sort of project that really disinvested in the communities. And so some of those existing challenges are both physical, but also mental. So the US-40 Expressway really creates a physical and mental divide between communities on either side. And so trying to find ways to reconnect those, which we'll get to a little bit more later in the presentation. Thinking about maintaining the vehicle traffic. So while this is a high-speed access road and we are trying to find ways to address that, we do need to recognize that folks do use this to get to and from downtown. And so how can we both reconnect the communities and think about multimodal transportation improvements, but still maintaining that vehicular traffic? Addressing the historically disinvested and dilapidated infrastructure. Housing is one of the main priorities that folks were interested and see a challenge to address. The lack of ADA compliance, again, right around the West Baltimore MARC station is one of the areas that folks really recognize as being lacking ADA compliance. That is sort of a key location that folks can get to get outside of this region when you're thinking about accessing Washington, D.C. and other major areas. And the lack of ADA compliance forces folks to have to go outside the community to access those areas. And then thinking about general safety and security. So we do know that there are some safety issues, there are concerns with violence in parts of the corridor, and so how can we overall look to address those? And then, like I said, there may be some challenges in the area, but there's also a lot of special places within the corridor. And so our members that came to the community workshop identified several areas that they are interested in preserving. And some of those include the cultural landmarks like the Harlem Park Theater. Several churches that are within this corridor were noted as areas to sort of preserve through this process. Overall, maintaining the character of community here, there is very strong sense of community, and making sure that when you're bringing in new development that it's not completely changing that, but that we are also acknowledging the community that was here before. And then trying to find ways to maintain the presence and the well-being of longtime residents. So again, when you're thinking about new development, TOD opportunities, et cetera, that can often take away from longtime residents. And so finding ways to maintain their well-being throughout this process and after the process. We also did a visioning exercise during the community workshops. And so again, you'll see a lot of these themes are being repeated, and they're sort of coming to the top as the key themes of interest to the community. But again, thinking about economic development and putting equity and sustainability at the core of this project, thinking about healthier neighborhoods and longer life expectancy. So not just the environment, but also the quality of life of the residents. Multimodal transportation, again, not just centering vehicles, but thinking about walking, pedestrians, transit access. There are several residents in the corridor who do not have access to a vehicle or who choose not to have access to a vehicle. And so making sure that they're able to get to and from locations that are necessary is very important. Maintaining the rich heritage, like I mentioned, is one of the areas that folks want to preserve and that they see as a long-term vision. And then bringing different types of development, so new housing, retail, and commercial opportunities to the corridor. And folks really see this as a place where generational wealth can be accrued. So like I said, bringing in new development that really focuses on some of the long-term residents and is not only focused on new and bringing in new people, but really sustaining the community that's there. And through all of this, sort of improved quality of life is inevitable with all these visions at the forefront. And then just building a community that is both economic and socially diverse. So again, mixing in new and the old. And then from that, as you can see, there are sort of a few key themes that come out of those items, and that is economic development and job creation, thinking about new and diverse investment, multimodal access, expanded transit, improved safety, and neighborhood beautification and revitalization. So those are sort of the building blocks to what will become the project's overall sort of goals, and working towards some of those long-term visions. Some other items that we have also been working on over the last several months are starting up the stakeholder work group, which they held their first meeting last week on June 3rd. So that is a group made up of community residents and business owners. There are 14 residents that are a part of that, community leaders that are a part of that group, and they will provide input, support, and they'll sort of serve as liaisons between the community and the project team for the duration of the project. So as I mentioned last week, they held their first meeting, which was really just an introduction to provide some initial thoughts of the meeting, but they will continue to meet over the next several months of the project's life cycle and bring thoughts from the community to us and be able to work alongside the project team. And then in addition to the stakeholder work group, we have several ongoing engagement activities. So we have attended some community meetings and ask you all to invite us to community meetings as they come about. I know the summertime, as Stu mentioned, is sort of a quieter time for a lot of community meetings, but once those do restart, we ask for folks to invite us to their community meetings so that we can really reach as many people as possible. This is meant to be an inclusive process, and we want to make sure that we're reaching folks as we can. In addition to that, we'll be doing canvassing events. So you may have seen some of our folks out last week canvassing, announcing the project update meeting tonight. And they'll be doing similar items as the project goes on, doing surveys with the community. And that's just a way to go sort of door to door and really reach the community members that may not be at the community meetings or may not be online and getting new information. We'll also be doing pop-ups throughout the corridor. So sad to see the Giant on Edmondson Avenue go. That is one place that we have done pop-ups prior to, but finding different locations that we can really meet the community where they're at to be able to ask questions, get input, and also share information about the project. So that will continue on through the life cycle of the project. And then as major events come about, we'll also be attending those. So AFRAM is coming up next weekend, so we'll have a table there where folks can sort of interact with the project team, ask questions, and give some of their thoughts. And so as I mentioned, we invite you all to let us know if there are particular community events that you think would be important for us to reach some of the community. We want you to let us know. You can find our project information on our website, where you can get in contact with us via email, or you can fill out a comment card. And so that's sort of the work that we have done up to date, but we also want to inform you of some of the work that we've been doing kind of in the background on some of these preliminary design pieces. And so I'll pass it over to Wes to sort of walk us through some of these preliminary alternatives, and then we'll open it up sort of for questions and feedback from you all.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name's Wes Mitchell, and I'm here. First of all, thank you, Tabia. Great job, as usual. So what I would like to do, Wes Mitchell with the study team, want to get into some of the ideas that we've been starting to evaluate as it comes to how do we get from where the trench is now to get it back to the point where it's at the surface. And understanding that there's a lot of different ways that you can do that from a design standpoint. So we want to make sure that we're giving those ideas, thinking through those options, and being able to provide some of those thoughts to you. So before we can get to some of the benefits that Tabia mentioned, where we're looking at how can we impact the economic viability of this area, how can we address some of the food insecurities and housing insecurities that may be faced in this area, how can we have this as a transformative project. Before we do all of those things, we have to figure out how do we go from this ditch to something that's back on the surface, right? So what is that? What does that mean? How does that look from an engineering standpoint? And those are the things that we want to talk about today. Now, keep in mind, we're just starting this process. We wanted to make sure that before we go too far down the line, that we're talking to the community, we're showing you some of the ideas. We're just, as we're throwing things up on the wall and see what sticks, we want to make sure that we're bringing you a part of that process. And that's what you'll see today is some of our preliminary ideas on how can we get from this to something that is back on the surface, that is in line with the elevation level of both Franklin and Mulberry Street at the surface, okay? So some of the ideas that we've come up with are 4 different design approaches. One is complete trench fill. I'll talk about all of these in more detail. A partial trench fill, complete deck over, and then a partial deck over. And the one thing that I want to talk about before we dive into these, you have to understand from an engineering perspective, a lot of our world is associated with trade-offs. There's not going to be one perfect alternative. There's not going to be one perfect concept. The idea is that there's going to be pluses and minuses associated. One may cost a little bit more. The other may be able to be completed a little faster. Others may be able to be done and provide better access from a traveling standpoint. So there's a lot of different things that we evaluate from an engineering perspective. So as we start to go through these alternatives, I'll start to give you an indication of how some of those have played out. So starting off, first one is a complete trench fill. So keep an eye on sort of the design that we're looking at here. We have, just to orient you, so this is a typical section, or cross section in which you're almost taking a sliver from top to bottom, right? And you're showing kind of what's in the middle there. What you're seeing here is more of a 3D image, kind of looking down on the corridor. So they're both the same general idea, same general concept, but they're showing just 2 different sort of vantage points. So the idea here is a full trench fill is, keep in mind, if we're just bringing in soil material, kind of dumping it into that trench area, continuing to put that fill material in and build it back up to the surface. realizing that, as Tabia mentioned, there are transportation elements both on the surface as well as underneath currently. We felt that all of our alternatives should at least have some component underneath for some level of travel. That could be transit, that could be vehicular movements, but having something under the surface to be able to facilitate those movements is still something that we thought made sense to keep in place. So you see that with all the alternatives. So with this particular fill idea, imagine looking at some of the other projects in the area. There may be materials that are coming from those particular construction jobs that could be coming into this area, making sure that they're suitable material, but then also bringing fill from other areas. All that would be tested, all that would be complementary to this area from an environmental standpoint. So building up these particular, building up the trench area with the fill material, realizing that when doing that, there are certain things that you can do. With the fill material, you may still be able to have some type of small building structures on top of that. You allow for more vegetation on that top surface. We may be able to put parks in that area. So it does open up a lot of opportunities there. And then in the area that is not that's not over that ditch area, there could still be other opportunities there as well. So this is one of the alternatives, just looking at just coming in and just filling in that ditch area. The next option that we evaluated is what we call our partial fill. So with the other alternative that I showed, which that full trenching kind of going from end to end, you think pretty much from like Payson Street all the way to Martin Luther King. But when doing that first option that I showed there, keep in mind that this is all in a tunnel. And when you're doing an end-to-end tunnel, you can see this, the whole surface is pretty much backfilled. And when you're doing that from a tunnel perspective, you have to think about when you have a tunnel from end to end, that means that you have to put in ventilation shafts associated with that. There's things like fire protection that has to go in place because it's all encased. There's also what we call sort of exit and entrance points like ingress and egress. How do you get out of that area in case of fire or what have you? So once you go into something where it's a full tunnel, there's a lot of other elements, a lot of other things that have to be considered with that. So looking at the second option here, in which we're still sort of taking fill material, filling in that particular ditch area. But what we have here, as you notice, is our partial deck where we're not going from end to end. If you see, we have little gaps, and we'll have sort of areas where you can have gaps in what we're filling back to the top so that you don't have to go to a full tunnel. So when you're thinking of those trade-offs, when you're thinking of, hey, we can put in certain segments here, a certain segment there, it still allows for you to put elements on top, but it also keeps you from having to go as far as doing full-blown ventilation shafts, which reduces the cost, can reduce the time frame as well. So just some ideas that we're looking at from a partial trench. The next option that we are considering is a complete deck over. When we're thinking the difference between the fill material versus the deck over is you would also have sort of those roadway or transit elements beneath, but then you're able to kind of almost put a deck on top of a structural sort of element there. So you have maybe structural walls on one side and you're putting a deck on top of that. So it's not quite the same as a tunnel that you're putting in, but it has a very similar idea in which you would be able to put surface back in place. You may be able to keep some of those bridges that are already there in place as well. But with this particular design, you may not be able to carry the same level of weight there. So you may not be able to put large buildings on top of this particular area, but you would still have an ability to put parks there, rec center, maybe rec elements, basketball courts, those types of things. So you can still have a lot of social elements that you would be able to bring into play, a lot more than that's what's there now. But ultimately, you would be restitching the network, restitching the community from what was lost 50 years ago. So this is sort of that end-to-end idea again. And then a very similar approach to what we looked at before is the partial deck over, which is the same idea, but once again, you have those gaps. So you're able to have almost daylighting at different points. Just to, with all of these potential ideas, we will be looking at making connections from the surface level down to the, especially if we're looking at any type of transit elements, we'll be able to put those in. So I just want to wrap this up, and then we'll open it up to questions in a sec. So that's pretty much the alternatives that we've evaluated. Where we are now is, and like I said, these are still very preliminary. These are still very early stages of what we're thinking of kicking around. This may not be our full set of ideas, full set of concepts. There are things that we are missing. That's why we're here to sort of talk through that. If there are areas of concern, we want to be able to hear those concerns. That's why we want to open it up for that level of dialogue. Where we're going for our next steps as far as this is going into more of the detailed engineering. We want to understand, what's there right now. We have some of those retaining walls that are alongside that ditch area now. What happens with those? Are they able to retain some of the bridges that are crossing over? Are they in good enough shape to keep in place? Do we need to modify those? Do we need to remove those? So those are the types of things that we want to get into further as part of our detailed engineering assessments. And then we'll be going into cost estimating, where we understand what are the costs, what are the schedule implications associated with these different alternatives, so that we can really evaluate what are the pros and cons of each of those, so that when we come back to the community at some point closer towards the end of the summer, that we can actually make sure that the community is able to make informed decisions of what we're seeing, what are some of the advantages, the disadvantages of these different options, or if there are new options that we didn't think of that we want to make sure that we bring forward. And then ultimately, we will be going for the idea here is to use this information to provide background data for a design and construction grant, which is the next phase of the feasibility grant funding that we received to come to this point in the study. So those are the things that we're going to be looking at from a next step standpoint.